We are 6 months down the line of implementing the Lisbon Treaty. We are starting to see the shape of the new foreign service called the European External Action Service, which normally should go live in the next few weeks. But I will use the image of a building site. Europe is very much now a building site whose blueprint is not clear enough to know what is going to be the end result. And this is very much what Lady Ashton, the new High Representative for Foreign Policy, has had to deal with. She had to, every step, to create the next step. But if you look at the other European institutions, I think you do see some change. The European Parliament has become more prickly and more difficult to deal with, more demanding, because it has gained, under the Lisbon Treaty, a role in deciding on budget. We are not yet in a Congress, US Congress system of appropriations, etc., but I think you do see that the European Parliament has become a more vocal player in the Brussels and the broader European scene. Then you have also the new EU president, the president of the European Union Council, Mr. Van Rompuy, who also is a new post, but the challenge, the institutional challenge has been, I would say, easier for him because it was more about upgrading an institution that already existed rather than creating an institution from scratch like Lady Ashton is trying to do. However, what you have seen over the past few months is a real competition between the post of the EU president and the one of the EU Commission president, José Manuel Barroso. So to summarize, I would say Brussels has not yet got all its act together, but it has become more competitive in terms of people, in terms of ideas, but you don't see yet an increase in power and influence. I think this will come with time. We're talking here about a 10-year timeline. The Lisbon Treaty was born out of, in fact, a failing democratic system for Europe. In fact, it was a result of the rejection by both French voters and Dutch voters of the previous incarnation of the Lisbon Treaty, which was called the European Constitution. So it was born in a democratic moment, but also in a moment where European people said, well, actually, we don't buy in that. We are not ready to support it. So I think it's born out of a crisis of public confidence. And the hope was that the Lisbon institutions, especially the fact that the European Parliament was made stronger, had a better say in the budget decisions made by the Commission and the heads of state. We have not seen yet more democracy reaching Europe. And I think this is the one big long-term weakness of the European construction, is that it has not managed to build a narrative with the European public. It has not managed to really make itself indispensable. And it's also the result of, I would say, an ambiguity game played by the European leaders who, over the last 20 to 30 years, have kept on blaming Brussels for all the bad decisions that they had to make at home. So, by doing that, in fact, they were shooting themselves in the foot, because they are the ones who are creating Europe. They are the ones who sit in Brussels once every while and make those decisions, like, for example, launching a new round of trade discussion, like creating the European External Action Service. So there has been this political game of blaming Brussels whenever you have to make some hard economic reform at home, that I think has undermined on the long term, the trust of the European people in the European construction. The European Parliament is also a paradox in the sense that it has not necessarily brought more democracy. People say, well, now we have an institution that is very active. Indeed, they are active, but it's not clear yet whether they do represent Europeans. If you look at all the previous European elections over the last 20 years, the level of participation of European voters has only decreased every time. And I think now we are at a level of around 40%, which actually is lower to the level of abstention that you have seen in Afghanistan during the presidential elections. So you do have a democratic deficit. And the question is, will the Lisbon Treaty make the European Council, which is the seat of the European heads of state, who have been elected by us more powerful and more central to those decisions. And I think it's not, democracy will not necessarily come from the European Parliament, as it should also come from the EU heads of state, and from them having a more coherent language about we're investing in Europe because this is our country's best chance to count in the next 10 or 20 years. Europe is a paradox because it's the first single market in the world. It's one of the biggest trading partners of the big other powers like the US, China, India. And yet Europe feels a sentiment of inferiority, of being on the decline, whilst the other powers are on the upcline. But if you look across the board at the big issues where Europe has a stake and is involved, you have global trade, you have global climate change policy, you also have obviously nuclear proliferation, and have the responses to difficult conflict situations like Afghanistan or Pakistan. And the scorecard on each of those issues, I would say, is probably the mark will be out of 10, I would say around 5 or 6. That means Europe is engaged indeed, like on global trade discussion, but the global trade system is stuck. The Doha round has not yet produced an agreement, and Europe has a real stake in that. And it has not been willing to compromise on its, for example, agricultural policy, which is to support its own farmers and to, in fact, keep the prices high, which means that other producers, especially in the developing world, can't have access to the European food market. So Europe on global trade has not yet got all its act together. On climate change, I think Copenhagen was a moment of truth for Europe, that until Copenhagen thought that we could lead by example, that our commitment to reduce by 20% in 2020 the carbon emissions was enough and compelling enough to bring the other powers like China, India, and the US on board. And clearly, Europe has missed an episode. And Europe now needs to play geopolitics on climate. It needs to sharpen its proposition. It needs to also make the case that a smart climate policy doesn't mean you are making your industry less competitive. So on that aspect, I think, which was seen as one of Europe's specialities to deal with global issues based on regulation, we still have a long way to go. On Afghanistan and Pakistan, so I would say a more traditional type of issue, a security issue, I think Afghanistan, from a European point of view, is lost. The European commitment is already weakening, both because of the lack of public support, but also of the lack of willingness by European leaders to really invest in making the European commitment work in terms of deploying troops. For example, Germany has deployed the third biggest level of troops in Afghanistan, but yet those troops are in the north of Afghanistan and not allowed to combat. So I think Europe has a long way to go in how it will be ready for the next Afghanistan to really put its military personnel, but also its aid development money at risk, and to really be able to frame that to their public opinion, to explain why does it matter to be in Afghanistan, why does it matter to support Pakistan. The euro crisis, I think, has had an immediate effect, which is an effect of distraction and fear among European leaders who, in fact, had to deal with the first major institutional stroke economic crisis of the European Union. The euro was conceived as the one big success, aside from the single market. And this one big success has been deeply shaken by the Greek default crisis, by the fact that the euro has reached almost the same point as when 10 years ago it was launched versus the dollar. So I think it has not only undermined European economies, it has also, I would say, created a contraction of ambition. It has created the sentiment that the European construction is not solid, and we need almost to redo the foundations. So what can they do? Europe, I think, needs to get a much stronger economic management system in place. We had if you want, the monetary union, but we did not have the union that comes with it in terms of fiscal union, in terms of economic governance. So I think there is a silver lining in this crisis, which is, as we know, Europe has always gone better and bigger out of crisis. Europe is born out of, in fact, the ashes of the Second World War as a reaction to a major crisis, saying we need to reconcile France and Germany to create peace on the European continent. So it could be that out of the Euro crisis, Europe gets better, not necessarily bigger, but I would say better and more focused on what it can do well, especially the economic side of things. We can probably characterize those relations as much better than they were after the Georgia War. So in a way, we have recovered from the 2008 war between Russia and Georgia. For example, the rapprochement between Russia and Poland is very significant in the sense that it heals a rift that was crossing or cutting Europe in half. On one side, you had the Russia-friendly Western European nations like France or Germany, and on the other side, you had the Russia-skeptical or Russia-opposed countries like Poland and the other Central European states and the Baltic states. This rift has healed. And this is very important to give Europe the possibility to have a more coherent approach to Russia. And that's the key point. It has not yet translated at the more regional level. So you see improvements in bilateral relationship with Russia, but it has not yet translated in real strategic partnership between Europe as a whole, that means the European Union, and Russia. To give you an example, a few weeks ago we had the EU-Russia summit in Rostov, which didn't produce much. Both sides didn't really meet the other side's expectations. The Russians wanted a freeing up of the visa system. The Europeans wanted Russia to do more on rule of law and protection of private interests, and there was not much achieved on that count. A week later, President Medvedev and Chancellor Angela Merkel met in Germany for a bilateral summit where some real decisions were made. The decision, for example, to set up a European Security Forum to discuss frozen conflicts between the eastern part of Europe and the western part. I think it's very significant, but was achieved in a bilateral relation rather than at the more regional level. So we still have this, I would say, difficulty to translate what has been happening between countries at the more European Union institution level. It is quite ironic, I think, that what you see in Brussels and European capitals is it's like almost if we have discovered that there are some emerging powers. Like if China has just arrived and India, as we all know that China has been on this trajectory for several decades. India also has been well on this path of growth and high level and high-tech jobs since probably 10 years. But yet Europe is coming at the point where it starts to ask itself the real questions, which is how do we engage? What do we want to get out of this relationship? And what you see is, again, a tension between trying to overcome relatively good bilateral relationship between, let's say, Paris and Beijing or Berlin and Beijing into something more strategic and looking at those emerging powers not anymore as economic powers, but as true global regional actors and have accordingly a global strategy. Like how do we work with China on questions of nuclear proliferation? I think the China-Pakistan deal on civil nuclear technology is very significant and is probably a warning sign to say, you know, Europe and the US need to work together to engage those emerging powers in order to stay within the international system. So Europe has not yet produced any significant or coherent strategy. The European heads of states are meeting in September to discuss this very issue. But again, we have a long way to go. But there is this sense that we need to translate our economic links with China. Europe is the first trading partner of China before the US, into real political or power clout. A deep long-term misunderstanding that could indeed threaten the relation between Turkey and Europe as a whole. This misunderstanding is the result of, in fact, us having missed a whole episode about what Turkey has become over the last 10 years since the economic reform of 2001. Turkey has defined itself, or is trying to define, a very active and activist regional role. It has used the vacuum that was created after and during the Iraq War, where the West, the US, but also Europe, were kind of withdrawing or were not welcome anymore in the Middle East. And so it has been very skilled at that. What we have missed in Europe is because we define Turkey through the enlargement process, which is an ongoing process, but it's going nowhere politically. So in a way, we have had a too narrow a lens to really understand what Turkey has become. And I think what is essential is that Europe and the US work together to really see how they can engage Turkey and have Turkey to play indeed its regional role. I think Turkey is entitled to have its own trajectory, but what is key is that this trajectory is linked to what the international community and Turkey's partners, Europe and the US, also need to achieve. If you look at the depth, the density, the extent of the economic, political, security relations between Europe and the US, I don't think you have any other historic example of such strong relation. But the paradox is this depth and density does not necessarily translate into an alignment of interest and strategy. And you can take all sorts of issues across the board. Turkey, we don't see eyes to eyes on Turkey. Climate change, clearly there is a difference of views, and the US politics don't play the way the European would like the US to be engaged on finding a solution to climate change. Global trade, again, we are more competitors, and our interests are not aligned to really find a solution with the Doha round. And you can name all different issues. AFPAC, Afghanistan, Pakistan. There is this paradox of the US asking Europe to do more, Europe claiming it does more, but in fact underinvesting politically in explaining the mission and trying to sell the mission to their population. So I think there is a real gap, strategic gap between Europe and the US. And the sense in Europe is that where Europe has lost a bit of transatlantic morale is the sense that the transatlantic relationship is not any longer defined based on European security, like it has been for 50 years during the Cold War. It has to be now defined on a set of global issues, global regional issues, where Europe and the US need to work together. Turkey is one. I think China, how to bring China within the multilateral system to play a more responsible role is also something of a shared interest. The global trade discussion is another aspect, and nuclear proliferation. But we have not yet fully come to terms with the fact that transatlantic relationship is not about European security anymore. It's about the global system. There is a contraction of ambition both in Europe and about Europe's role in the world. But this is something you see across the board in the Western world. I mean, the United States becomes also much more reluctant about whether it is ready to engage in new crises apart from Afghanistan and Pakistan. It's true that across Europe you do see a real decrease in defense investments. The UK is going through its own strategic defense review, and we already know that they will be cutting defense budget by 25%. But we have to remember one important fact is Europe has stopped investing in defense already 10 years ago. The European defense investment has plateaued since the year 2000. The real increase was in the US and in the emerging powers. So Europe has underinvested in its security since, I would say, a good decade. So it's true that now we are feeling the effect of this lack of investment, which means it's a real struggle to send troops and to send capabilities abroad to respond to crises like Afghanistan, but also other ones, Chad, Congo, Somalia, Yemen. So I think Europe's capacity to respond to crises has diminished but it has a sense that it has also to play a role in the world. So there is this tension between not doing enough, but knowing that we need to do more in the future. The key is that Europe's destiny is not sealed, neither in negative terms or positive terms. So if you look at in 2050, Europe could well stay in the top 5 economic powers, as well as it could start falling and be more in a kind of group of 20 or even below. So there is a real challenge that is put before the European leaders and in fact European people about what are they ready to do to make Europe more competitive, to make Europe more productive at home, because the strength in your foreign policy, in your capacity to project power starts at home. I think that's one of the kind of key entry points of the new US national security strategy, is that you can't have a strong foreign policy if you don't have a strong economy and a good demography. So Europe needs to get a better demography, needs to reform its welfare system to get a system that creates security for people, but also does not strangle competitiveness. It needs to invest more in innovation and high tech. So Europe needs to do more than what it does now, but I don't think Europe is on a kind of a decline that can't be stopped. I think we are now in a more relative world where there is not such a thing as an absolute power, as one power, but I think Europe needs to do some reform at home to be more to stay at the table of the major powers in the next 20 or 30 years.